This is a special report from CBS News. Good evening. This is Walter Cronkite at CBS News headquarters in New York. Well, at its beginning, this day looked as though it might be one of armed conflict between Soviet vessels and American warships on the sea lanes leading to Cuba.
After World War II, U.S. and Soviet relations broke down and became hostile. This brought about an era known as the Cold War. During the Cold War, the world was divided by politics and ideology between what was known as the East and the West. The end of World War II brought about a new age of warfare in the form of the atomic bomb. During the 1950s, both superpowers tested massive amounts of nuclear weapons, demonstrating both of their powers. One incident during this war was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Cold War could have turned nuclear. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day-long period starting on October 16th, during which the two superpowers of the world, the United States and the Soviet Union, came closest to nuclear war. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw an opportunity to strengthen the relationship between the Soviet Union and Cuba. He made a promise to Fidel Castro to protect them from the United States. In May of 1960, Khrushchev began to ship ballistic missiles to Cuba. He believed that President Kennedy was weak and that he would not react. During the crisis, the U.S. Strategic Air Command was placed on DEFCON 2, while the rest of America was placed on DEFCON 3. America was placed on the highest ever DEFCON during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In order to understand this conflict and why it came to be, you need to go back further. The Bay of Pigs invasion started in March of 1960 when the CIA set up training camps to train 1,400 Cuban deserters to invade Cuba. Kennedy's plan was to call 2 airstrikes on Cuban air bases and to launch a 1,400-man surprise invasion on the southern coast of Cuba. Once they attacked, there were multiple mishaps. The rebel force came under heavy fire and, after less than a day of fighting, 114 men were killed and over 1,100 were taken prisoner. This invasion was a major failure by the U.S. government, attributed to heightened American-Cuban-Soviet tensions, and compelled Cuba to seek help from the Soviets. The day is October 14th, 1962, 2 days before the official start of the Cuban Missile Crisis. American U-2 spy planes have taken pictures of Soviet-made medium-range missiles in Cuba. These missiles were stationed 90 miles off of the American coast and were also capable of carrying nuclear warheads that could reach D.C. This granted indisputable evidence of a Soviet presence of some sort in Cuba. Earlier in September of that same year, analysts from the Defense Intelligence Agency noticed that some Cuban missile sites were arranged in a similar pattern to those used by the Soviet Union. This occurrence, along with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, is what spurred the investigation in Cuba. The president does not see the photos until they are analyzed by intelligence officers, which is 2 days later on October 16th. On October 16th, President John F. Kennedy was briefed on the U-2 spy plane's findings. The U.S. had no plan for dealing with such a threat because U.S. intelligence was convinced that the Soviets would not install offensive weapons in Cuba. Kennedy, along with some national defense officials, discussed 5 courses of action. 1. Do nothing. 2. Use diplomatic pressure. 3. An air attack on the missile sites. 4. A full-on military invasion. And 5. A naval quarantine of Cuba. They ruled out 3 of the 5 options and decided on either a naval quarantine or an airstrike. President Kennedy kept his normal office schedule as to not worry the American public. This day was considered the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 18th, President Kennedy is visited by Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. Gromyko claims that all weapons placed in Cuba are purely defensive, and he never admits to having nuclear ballistic missiles stationed in Cuba. Kennedy doesn't reveal that he knows about the missiles, and he restates his public warning of September 4th. that the greatest consequences would follow if Soviet offensive weapons were introduced to Cuba. This was a great diplomatic step into de-escalating the crisis at hand. For the past 3 days, Kennedy's top advisors have been debating on the appropriate course of action, while Kennedy was on a campaign trip. On October 21st, President Kennedy meets with General Walter Sweeney of the Tactical Air Command, who tells him that an airstrike would not 100% guarantee the destruction of the missiles. This strengthens Kennedy's decision for diplomacy instead of war. Also, on October 22nd, Kennedy addresses the nation on the current situation in Cuba. On October 23rd, an American ambassador to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, laid out what has happened during the crisis so far in front of the United Nations. He showed pictures of the missile sites in Cuba, among other documents. The Soviet ambassador present still declined to comment on the existence of missiles in Cuba. Also, some Soviet submarines moved into the Caribbean area, threatening the naval quarantine. One such submarine was a Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine. A U.S. Navy ship dropped depth charges which are designed to tell the submarine to surface. The sub was out of contact with the outside world, and 2 out of the 3 men on board assumed that they were at war and wanted to fire nuclear torpedoes. Thankfully, Vasily Arkhipov was on board and he decided not to fire. If he had fired them, there would have most likely been an all-out nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Later on, Robert Kennedy met with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin to, quote, give him some background on the decisions of the United States government. Dobrynin continued to deny the presence of missiles in Cuba. On October 24th, Khrushchev replies to Kennedy's letter saying that the quarantine in place is not just a quarantine, rather an act of war. He also says, quote, you are no longer appealing to reason but wish to intimidate us. Then, the day after, on the 25th, Kennedy, knowing that some missiles in Cuba are functional, sends a letter to Khrushchev urging him to change the course of these events. Later that day, United Nations Secretary General U Thant calls for a cooling off period, which Kennedy rejects because it would leave the missiles in Cuba. On October 26, Fidel Castro drafts a letter to Khrushchev telling him that if the United States invaded Cuba, the Soviet Union should initiate a nuclear fire strike. Also on this day, an ABC News reporter, John Scali, was approached by Alexander Fomin of the Soviet embassy staff with a proposal for a solution to the crisis. Later on, Khrushchev sends Kennedy a long, rambling letter proposing a similar offer, removing the missiles from Cuba in exchange for lifting the quarantine, and a pledge that the US would not invade Cuba. The next day, Moscow sends a letter with tougher terms. They also wanted the US to remove the obsolete Jupiter missiles from Turkey. On that same day in Cuba, a U-2 plane is shot down by a Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile. Kennedy chooses not to escalate the situation further. Finally, on October 28, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis officially ends. Radio Moscow broadcasts that the Soviet Union has accepted the United States' proposed solution, that the missiles will be removed from Cuba in exchange for a non-invasion pledge from the United States, and the removal of the Jupiter missiles in Turkey. The choice for diplomatic compromise from both Kennedy and Khrushchev is what, in the end, saved the world from nuclear destruction. The aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of mixed feelings. 1 year after the end of the crisis, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Similarly, 2 years after the crisis, Nikita Khrushchev fell from power, partly due to the missile crisis. Because the Soviets didn't know about the removal of the Jupiter missiles, from their perspective it looked like an embarrassment. On the bright side, the US and the Soviet Union created the Moscow-Washington Hotline, which was designed for the two nations to communicate directly in case of a future crisis. Cuba viewed the outcome as a betrayal by the Soviets, which caused Soviet-Cuban relations to deteriorate. On the other hand, Cuba continued to be protected from an invasion. In the end, it's truly amazing that the biggest conflict during the Cold War between two rival nations was solved not with violence, but with compromise.